Hello everyone, I'm Jacob Kaufman, I'm the Nerd in the Street, and today we are installing Nextcloud 21, Collabora Online, and the Nextcloud High Performance Backend. Alright everyone, so if you found this video just looking for a Nextcloud installation tutorial, welcome, we'll get started in just a minute. If you're a returning viewer, I do just want to take a minute to talk about what's going to be different about today's Nextcloud installation versus previous ones that I've showed on this channel. For one thing, Nextcloud 21 is brand new, it was just released last month. It's got a number of new features like a new whiteboard app and improvements to the Talk app and the Markdown text editor app, so plenty of new things in the base Nextcloud installation. Secondly, since I last covered Collabora Online, they have begun publishing native Linux packages for their program. That means you don't need to use Docker to set this up on your server anymore. Over the past couple of years, I've had people asking me questions about Collabora setup. They've had trouble with some of the Docker commands and they want help troubleshooting. And for many months now, my answer has been that that video is outdated and that you really ought to be using the native Linux packages these days instead of Docker. The native packages take up less resources on your server, so it's less you have to install and it's less that has to run since it's not in a container. That means you can have lower powered hardware and support more users on the Collabora instance at the same time. The native packages also offer easier configuration in my opinion. So in today's video, we will be using those native packages. There will be no Docker today. And finally, the third big difference between this video and previous Nextcloud videos is that we'll be installing the new high performance backend. This was introduced alongside Nextcloud 21, and it's a Rust binary that basically handles notifications for your server. Now with a standard installation, a Nextcloud server is running fully on PHP, and PHP is a scripting language. It doesn't really do anything unless you make a request to it. So in order to get notifications, any Nextcloud clients, which would include the website or desktop or mobile clients, they have to check in with the server every 30 seconds to check if there are any new notifications. And if you have multiple tabs of Nextcloud open in your web browser, all of those tabs are checking separately every 30 seconds since tabs in your web browser can't communicate with each other. So 3 tabs in your web browser would be a request to your server every 10 seconds, or 3 users would be a request every 10 seconds. 10 tabs or 10 users would be a request every 3 seconds. And every time the server's handling one of those requests, it has to turn around and check the MySQL database to see if there are any new notifications, and then it has to send them back. So that really adds up. So this new high-performance backend, like I said, it's a binary. It was written in Rust. You don't need Rust installed on your server to run it. But it basically just sits there and handles notifications. It establishes a WebSocket connection with any clients, and it's actually able to send notifications proactively when they're ready. So rather than a fetching system where clients have to check periodically for notifications, this new high-performance backend is a push system where the server can just send the notification when it's ready. Now, by default, the clients are still going to check in with the server every 5 minutes to see if there are any notifications, just in case that high-performance backend fails. We don't want the clients to be left without notifications for a long period of time. So every 5 minutes, they'll just check as a fallback to make sure that they're in sync notification-wise. But this new system removes a lot of load from the server, especially if you've got a lot of users on your system or if you tend to have it open in a lot of windows or tabs at once. It's a really interesting new feature. It's an interesting way that they're handling a bottleneck in their system. Rather than trying to optimize the heck out of their PHP program, they're just providing an auxiliary component to take over some of the functionality. So we are going to set that up. Because it's so new, I would expect that the first part of this video to get outdated will be the high-performance backend setup. The documentation's still a little shaky, and I wouldn't be surprised if that setup does change in the near future, but for right now, I am going to show you how to set it up just so we can take a look at it. All the commands I'm about to run are listed in a link in the description of this video, so take a look at that if you're following along at home. But without further ado, we'll go ahead and cut to the desktop and get started installing Nextcloud 21. Alright, and here we are on the desktop. We're going to be using Linode today. If you don't have a server already, you can go to linode.knots.co to get started with them. Of course, you can also use DigitalOcean, Vultr, or any other cloud hosting provider of your choice if you don't have your own physical server to use. And you can find links to some of those alternatives down in the description as well. But I'm going to go ahead and create a Linode here. We're going to be using Debian 10 for our operating system today. These instructions should be very similar on Ubuntu 20.04. We're just using Debian because it's a little bit lighter weight without all of Canonical's software on top. top. I'll select my region here, and I am going to use the cheapest plan possible. You can select a higher plan if you need more storage, but in terms of the actual resources here, RAM and CPU, you shouldn't need too much if you're only going to have 1 or 2 people using your server. I'll set a label here just to make this easier to identify. I'll set a tag, and I will enter in a root password, but I will also select my SSH key so I don't have to type that password in manually. That's everything that we need to set here, so I'll click Create. And while that's provisioning, we're going to copy the IP address and come over to our domain control panel. Now you do need a domain name to use Let's Encrypt to get an SSL TLS certificate, because Let's Encrypt uses the domain name to identify you when issuing that certificate. So I'll come into my domain control panel here, and I'm going to add an A record. I'll use the host name Nextcloud, so our domain name is going to be nextcloud.nerdonthestreet.com, and I'll paste in my IP address there. I am going to turn the time to live down because I'm planning on deleting this later. Now, it might take a few minutes for that domain name record to propagate, but while that's happening, we can go ahead and open up a terminal and SSH into our server here using the IP address. I'll type in my SSH passphrase, and we are logged in. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is entirely optional. As you can see, my host name right now is just localhost. I'd like to have a more personalized prompt here, so I'm going to go ahead and set a host name on this machine. To do that, I'll run hostname ctl set hostname nextcloud. And I'm also going to nano into my etc hosts file, and I'm going to add a new entry here, 127.0.1.1, and I'll type in Nextcloud there as well. Now, there's a reason I'm not putting the entire nextcloud.nerdonthestreet.com fully qualified domain name in here. This would technically be valid configuration, but it actually messes up the Apache configuration that we're going to do. The reasoning for that's a little bit outside the scope of this video, but if you're a Nerd Club member, I'm putting a link to a behind-the-scenes video in the description of this video if you want to learn a little bit more about when and how Apache uses this etc hosts file. Like I said though, it's outside the scope of this video, so all you need to know is that we're putting our host name, not our fully qualified domain name, in our etc hosts file. We'll save that, we'll exit, we'll SSH into the same server again, and you can see that now we have a root at Nextcloud prompt. So now we can run an apt update just to make sure all of our package lists are up to date before we install all of our required packages here. And it looks like all the packages are up to date, which is nice. I'm going to copy and paste this apt install command in just because it's a lot to type, but we will go through some of these just to see what they are. So Apache 2 is the web server that we're using today. MariaDB is our database server. It's MySQL compatible. PHP Common is going to bring in the PHP scripting language the Nextcloud's written in. We've got libapache 2 mod PHP to hook PHP in with Apache. PHP MySQL will allow PHP programs to access our MariaDB database. And we've got various other PHP modules that are listed in the Nextcloud admin guide. For example, PHP ImageMagick is going to allow PHP programs to use the ImageMagick image processing software, which it uses to create thumbnails in Nextcloud. Now, toward the end here, we've got Redis server, and this is going to be our memory caching server today. In the past, I've showed how to use APCU because it's the easiest and simplest caching server to set up, but today we're using Redis because the high-performance backend that we're going to set up later requires this one rather than either of the other options. So we've got that we're installing, and finally we've got Python certbot Apache. That is going to be the Apache plugin for certbot, which is also going to pull in the base certbot program as a dependency to allow us to generate our SSL certificate later. So I'll go ahead and install all of these things. All right, and that is all done installing. The first thing we're actually going to configure here is our Redis memory caching server. To do that, I'll nano into etc redis.conf. And I'm going to do a search for Unix socket. Now, by default, Redis is going to listen using a networking stack. It's not going to listen from any external networking interfaces. It's only going to listen for connections from local hosts, but it is going to be listening over a TCP socket, which means that we theoretically have a little bit more overhead, encapsulating that data into TCP segments. And theoretically, it might also be a little bit less secure since it's relying on the networking stack on your machine. Since this is a small server and we want to get the best performance and best security possible, we're going to use a Unix socket instead. So we'll uncomment this Unix socket line. It's going to use this particular file for its socket, and that way programs can access Redis without having to go through networking at all. We're also going to uncomment the Unix socket permission option here, and the default is 700, which means that only the Redis user is able to access the memory caching server. We're going to add Apache to the Redis group later, so we also want to give the Redis group access to the server. So we'll change this permission to 770 so that the user and the group can access the server and other people cannot. After that, I'm going to come up just a little bit here, and this port 6379 line, this is the default TCP port that we'd be listening through. Since we're not going to be using that, we'll just disable TCP altogether by setting that to port 0. We'll save that configuration file, and we will add the Apache user to the Redis group with usermod-a capital G. That's to add a user to an additional group. The group name is Redis, and the user is www.data. Next, we're going to configure Apache, so we will copy our default virtual host configuration file from etc apache2 sites available 000default.conf to etc apache2 sites available nextcloud.conf. We will nano into that new nextcloud.conf file. And we'll come down here. The first thing we'll set as our server name. We're going to set that to nextcloud.nerdonthestreet.com. That way Apache knows that when somebody connects to this host name, it needs to send this website. Certbot's also going to read that value later when we generate the SSL certificate. The server admin option here doesn't really do anything, but we can set it just for fun. And the document root, I'm going to set this to var www nextcloud, and that is going to be the directory where the Nextcloud application files are extracted to later. We'll save that virtual host configuration file, and we'll enable that virtual host with A2 Insight Nextcloud. I do have a whole video about virtual hosts if you want to learn more about the configuration that goes on in that file. Before we reload Apache here, we're also going to enable a couple of modules with A2 InMod, rewrite, and headers. The rewrite module is needed for the simple URL scheme that will enable the Nextcloud later, and the headers module is needed for HSTS, an SSL option that we'll also enable later. So we'll run that, and you can see that we now no longer just need to reload Apache, we actually need to restart Apache. So we'll run systemctl restart Redis Apache 2 to restart both Redis and Apache, making all of the configuration we've done so far take effect. Now we can go ahead and download Nextcloud. We're going to use wget for that, and I'm going to open up my web browser again and go to nextcloud.com to get the download link. Up at the top right, we'll go to Get Nextcloud and Server Packages, and underneath the details and download options, we're going to copy the tar.bz2 link. We'll come back to our terminal and paste that in. That's going to be downloaded and saved to our root user's home directory on this server. And we will extract that file using tar-xvf, that's extract verbose, and the file name of the archive, which is going to be nextcloud-the version number.tar.bz2. Then we're going to use a -C to set our destination where we're extracting to, and we'll set that to var www. Now the reason I'm doing it this way is because I already know this nextcloud tar.bz2 file contains a directory called nextcloud that all the files are inside of. So we're going to extract to var www, and we're going to end up with a folder var www nextcloud, which is what we configured in Apache earlier. So we'll run that, and since we used the verbose option, you can see it go through all the different files there. And that is complete. So if we do an ls-alh on var www nextcloud, you can see that that directory does exist. Now you can see the permissions are currently set so that nobody owns those files. We do need Apache to own those files. To do that, we'll run chown-R for recursive, www.data, and a colon to set both the user and the group, var www nextcloud. We'll run that, and if we run our ls command again, you can see all of these files and directories are now owned by our Apache user. Now by default, Nextcloud is going to create a data directory inside of this var www folder, and that's where it's going to store your files that you upload into Nextcloud. Personally, I like to make a dedicated data directory somewhere else, just so that if the Apache configuration goes haywire at any point, all of my personal files aren't served by the web server. So I'm going to run makedir/ncdata. This is just going to create a directory on the root of our server. We do still need to give Apache permission to access that directory, so to do that, I'll run chown www.data:/ncdata. And finally, we can remove the Nextcloud tar.bz2 file. Since we've already extracted this, we don't need the archive sitting there anymore. So at this point, if we open up a web browser, we can go to nextcloud.nerdonthestreet.com. And you can see it will load our Nextcloud setup page here. Before we actually complete this, there are a couple more things we need to do. For one thing, up in our URL bar here, we are currently connected with regular old HTTP. Firefox is hiding that from us for some reason, but we do have a little insecure icon here because we're not using SSL. So to take care of that, we'll come back to our terminal and we'll run certbot-Apache. That's going to walk us through the process for setting up SSL TLS. It's going to ask for an email address first. I'm going to agree to the terms of service, not subscribe to the email list, and it's going to read our Apache configuration and offer the nextcloud.nerdonthestreet.com domain name. I'll hit enter to accept that. It'll verify that this server is in control of that domain name. And once it's done that, it's going to offer to set up a redirect for us, which we will take it up on by selecting the option 2 there. So TLS has now been configured, and if we just refresh this page, we will be redirected to https nextcloud.nerdonthestreet.com. You can see that it's also going to ask us for our database information, and we haven't set that up yet either. So we'll come back to our terminal again, and the first thing we'll run is mysql_secure_installation. This is a script that's going to walk us through some good security practices for our database. The first thing it'll ask us to do is set a root password, which I'll go ahead and enter in here. For everything else, we can just accept the defaults. And once that's done, we can access the MariaDB server using the MariaDB command. We're going to create a database, Nextcloud. We will create a user, Nextcloud, at localhost. It should only be logging in from this server. Identified by, and we'll give the database user its own password. And finally, we will grant all privileges on our Nextcloud database and all tables of that database to our Nextcloud user. And once again, it's only allowed to access that database when logging in from localhost. After that, we can quit out of MariaDB and we can come back to our web browser. And now we can fill out this setup page. So I'm going to enter in a username for my admin account and another super secure password for it there. For the data folder here, we are going to change that to the /nc data directory that we created. And for our database, I'll enter in the database user we just created, the database user's password, and the database name, which is also Nextcloud. Now down here, we've got an option to install recommended apps. We are not going to do this, and the reason is because one of the things this will install is collaborative editing. If we just do a quick search for Nextcloud Store Collabora, the first option here is a built-in code server, and this is actually an app image package of the server component of Collabora. The reason we're not using this has to do with a lot of the same reasons we're not using the Docker package for Collabora. This app image package is going to run a little bit slower than a native installation. It's also not going to be quite as straightforward to configure. Also, it's not always up to date. When Nextcloud 21 was released, this checkbox actually errored out when you finished installing the setup for a good week or two. They didn't update this code server to support Nextcloud 21 very quickly. The client app was updated almost immediately, but the server app, they would install it automatically and it would fail, which isn't great QA on their part. Since we're going to be setting up our own Collabora server later using the native Collabora packages, we're not going to install this built-in code server. We will uncheck this recommended apps option, and if you want any of the other apps like the calendar app or the talk app or the mail client, you can install those manually from the Nextcloud App Store very easily. So I'll click Finish Setup, and eventually that will redirect us to our Nextcloud dashboard. If this is your first time using Nextcloud, you can read the slideshow there if you want to. I'm just going to skip through that, and I'll go to the top right menu and go to our Settings app. Underneath the administration section, I'll go to the overview, and as usual, there are going to be a number of security and setup warnings here. We're going to take care of all of these in just a couple of fell swoops here. We'll come back to our terminal, and the first thing we'll address is the PHP configuration on our server. So we'll nano into etc php 7.3 apache 2 php.ini, and inside of there, I'm going to do a search for memory limit. This is set to 128 megabytes by default. We need to raise that to 512 megabytes. I'm also going to do a search for output_buffering. And the second search result here, the one that's set to 4096 by default, we're going to change that to off with a capital O to disable output buffering altogether. We'll save that file. Next, we're going to address our Apache configuration. So I'll nano into etc apache 2 sites enabled nextcloud-le-ssl.conf. So this is the copy of our configuration file that Certbot created for us earlier. And down here underneath the document root section inside of this 443 virtual host, I'm going to copy and paste this configuration in just because it's a lot to type, but once again, I am going to explain what it is here. So first we're saying if we have the module headers enabled, which we did enable earlier, we're going to set the HSTS HTTP strict transport security header in the the HTTP data of every packet that we send out. This is going to tell any web browser that connects that for the next 180 days, set in seconds there, it should not attempt to make any unencrypted connections to this website. When you type in this host name, your web browser should go straight to 443. It should not need to use that redirect from regular HTTP. Next, we're saying that inside of the var www nextcloud directory, we are going to allow overrides for our configuration. That's going to allow the .htaccess file that Nextcloud includes to work. So we'll save that configuration. We'll restart Apache with systemctl restart Apache 2. And after that, we can check out how we're doing in terms of those warnings. That gets rid of a good number of them there, and the only stuff that's left has to do with our Nextcloud configuration. So to edit that, we're going to nano into var www nextcloud config.php. Now this is just a PHP file that's being included in all the other PHP files in Nextcloud, so we don't need to restart the web server. Anything that we change in here will take effect immediately, or the next time that we access the Nextcloud page. The first option that we're going to add here does not actually address any messages that Nextcloud was giving us, but we are going to use the simple URL scheme like I mentioned earlier. Right now, if we look at our Nextcloud server, the URL we're browsing to is nextcloud.nerdonthestreet.com/index.php/settings-admin-overview. By default, every single URL on your Nextcloud server is going to include index.php. If I hover over some other links here, you can see in the bottom left that all of those URLs have index.php in them. We're just going to shorten that. And the real meat of the configuration to do that is already present in the .htaccess file by default. We just need to set the htaccess.rewrite base option, and we're going to set that to just a /. While we're in this file, we're also going to set our default phone region that Nextcloud was asking us for. We'll set that to US. And then we'll also set up our Redis memory caching here. So we'll set memcache.local to /OC/memcache/Redis. We're also going to set memcache.distributed. And the difference between APCU that I've shown how to use in the past and Redis, which we're using today, is that Redis can actually support a distributed configuration where you have several different front-end Nextcloud servers that are serving the same back-end database and files. When you're doing that, you need the servers to use the same distributed memcache server so that they don't get out of sync with each other. Even though we only have one server today, we're still going to set the distributed option. We're going to set that to the exact same thing, OC memcache Redis. And finally, we will put in the parameters for our Redis server. That is going to be inside of square brackets for an array. Our host is going to be the Unix socket path that we set up. So that's going to be var run redis server.sock. And we also want to set a port, but that port will be 0 since once again, this is a native Unix socket. We'll save that. To make that rewrite base option take effect, we're going to run sudo -u www-data. So we're running a command as the web server. The command we're running is going to be PHP, and we want to run the var www nextcloud OCC script. That stands for own cloud console. And the command within that script we want to run is maintenance :update :htaccess. We'll run that. We get a message .htaccess has been updated. So now if we come back to our Nextcloud server and refresh this, you can see that we now get that nice green check mark because all of our setup and security checks are passing. And also, if I come up here to my URL bar, I can just delete index.php and this page still loads exactly the same way. All of the links within Nextcloud have also been updated, so if I click back to my dashboard here, we're no longer at index.php/apps/dashboard. Now we're just at /apps/dashboard. All of the URLs in this program are now a little bit shorter. So that's everything you need to do to get the basic Nextcloud setup running. If I click on my notifications there, you can see they're recommending different apps for us to install, which I'll just ignore. It's also going to ask you if you want to show native desktop notifications. I'm going to click no right now. The next thing we want to do is set up our Collabora server. If we come over to the files section here, you can see if I try to add a new file, I can add a plain text document, but I can't add a rich text document, and I can't add a spreadsheet or a presentation either. For that stuff, we need Collabora. Now, Collabora is going to require another subdomain. It's going to point to the same server, but I am just going to quickly come back to my domain name control panel here. And that exact same IP address that is being used for Nextcloud, I'm just going to add another record. That'll be collabora.nerdofthestreet.com. We'll type the IP address in there. Once again, I'll set the time to live to the minimum. And we'll save that now so that by the time we get to using it in a few minutes, it will have propagated. Back here in our Nextcloud server, I am going to go to the apps section, and we do need to install the Collabora client app, even though we're doing the server part manually. So underneath Office and Text here, we'll look for Collabora Online. And once again, we're not doing the built-in code server, we're just looking for the one called Collabora Online. I'll click download and enable on that. And once that is enabled, if we come back to our settings section, I can scroll down and find our Collabora Online page of the settings. This is where we'll configure our server. Of course, the server's not set up yet. So let's come back to our terminal and do that now. We're going to run apt install GNU-PG. We're going to need GNU-PG to import the signing key for the Collabora packages. Once that's been installed, I'm going to paste a command here to import the Collabora signing key from Ubuntu's key server. I'm going to paste another command. This is going to add the Collabora Online repository to our sources.list configuration file for apt. If you want to just edit this file manually, you can do that. I'm just using this echo command because it's simpler to copy and paste. So now if we run an apt update, you can see that in addition to our normal Debian repositories, we will also fetch package lists for Collabora. And now we can run an apt install. We're going to install LOOLWSD, that is the LibreOffice Online WebSocket daemon the Collabora is based on. We're also going to install CodeBrand to pull in the Collabora front-end packages. And we also want Hunspell. That is our spell checking program. If you don't install that, then spell checking will not work. We'll run this. As you can see, we're pulling in all of the different Collabora applications as dependencies. So we've got Writer, Calc, Impress. We'll let that install. We do need to set up a virtual host to act as a proxy for the Collabora server. So once again, I'm going to copy our etc Apache 2 sites available 000 default.conf file. This time I'll copy it to etc Apache 2 sites available collabora.conf. We'll nano into that file. Down here, we do need to set our server name again, so that will be collabora.nerdonthestreet.com. But these server admin and document root lines, we're actually just going to delete both of those this time, because we don't need to serve any files with this virtual host. It's just a reverse proxy that's going to point to our Collabora server. So we'll save this very empty configuration file, and we're going to enable that site, Collabora. We'll reload Apache 2. And the reason I'm doing this is because we need to set up SSL for that virtual host, and it's easiest to do that when the site is enabled. So we'll run certbot-Apache again. It's going to recognize that we have two different domain names now, and we'll hit enter to select all of them. It'll ask us if we want to get a separate certificate for Collabora or if we just want to expand our initial certificate. We'll enter capital E to expand the initial certificate. There's no benefit to having two separate certificates for those two domain names. So it's going to renew that first certificate, but this time it's also going to verify that the server's in control of collabora.nerdonthestreet.com. And once again, we will select the option to set up a redirect. The redirect was already set for our Nextcloud virtual host, but now it should also be set for our Collabora virtual host. Now, there are a couple of Apache modules we need to enable for this reverse proxy setup to work, and those are proxy and the submodules proxy_WS tunnel, that's WebSocket tunnel, and proxy_HTTP. We're going to nano into etc Apache 2 sites enabled, Collabora, lessl.conf. Once again, we want to make sure we're editing the 443 virtual host that will get redirected to by Apache. And inside of here, I'm going to paste a large chunk of configuration, once again, because this would be a lot to type out on video. But just to go through this, we're going to set some options. We don't ever want to show indexes for our Collabora application files. Collabora requires us to allow encoded slashes in URLs. And then down here, we're just going to set up our proxy. So we're going to keep the host when proxying requests so that Collabora knows who it's talking to. Anything that tries to access collabora.nerdonthestreet.com/log hello leaflet is going to be proxied to our Collabora server running on a different port. We'll do the same thing for our discovery file here. Anything that accesses that via port 443 will be redirected to port 9980 on this machine. The same thing for the capabilities file. And down here, we will proxy our web sockets. So once again, this is just a file that will be accessed by our web browser, but it's going to be proxied to the WebSocket that Collabora is serving on. And there are a couple more WebSockets, a couple more regular HTTP files, and that's the entire configuration. So all of that information just comes from Collabora's own documentation. But I'll go ahead and save it, and we'll run systemctl restart Apache 2 to make all of that configuration take effect. I'm also going to nano into Etsy loolwsd.xml. That is the LibreOffice Online WebSocket daemon configuration file. The first thing I'm going to do is set up this allowed languages line. If we come to the end of that line, this is a list of languages that the spell checker will use, and it's the order that it will prefer them in. Now, if you want to leave all of these enabled, but you want to default to English, you can just move in US to the front here. However, as the message here in the description notes, if you allow too many languages, it does affect performance of Collabora, particularly when it's loading. So since I'm only ever going to want to spell check in US English, I'm going to delete all the other options from allowed languages here and leave that as the only language enabled. Next, I'm going to do a search for SSL, and down here under SSL settings, there are a few things we need to do. Our SSL option here, we're going to set that to false. Now it says here in the description for this one, do not disable for production deployment. However, this is safe to do in our case because this very next option, SSL termination, we're going to set that to true. So what's happening is the data will be encrypted with SSL from the web browser to Apache on this server. It is going to be unencrypted going from Apache to LibreOffice Online on this server. But that unencrypted data is never going onto any network. It's not going onto the wire. It's staying local on this machine. So this is perfectly secure. If somebody were to compromise this machine and be able to read that data while it's passing between two different applications on the same box, they would be able to access your SSL certificates anyway, and they would be able to access the data when it's decrypted at any stage of the process, even if we weren't using this termination option. And this makes configuration a bit easier when we're doing it this way, where we just configure SSL with Apache. LibreOffice Online doesn't need to know where our cert files or our key files are. So that's how this is going to be set up. Finally, I'm going to do a search for welcome, and there is an option here to show a welcome screen every time that Collabora gets updated. Similar to the Nextcloud welcome screens, I just don't find those Collabora welcome screens very useful. It's a document editor. People are probably going to know how to use it without having to click through a slideshow, so I'll set that to false. We'll save that, and we'll go ahead and restart LOOLWSD. And finally, if I come back to our web browser, we can type in https://collabora.nerdonthestreet.com as the URL of our Collabora Online server. I'll click save, and you can see it says Collabora Online server is reachable, and we now have a few more advanced options that I'm not going to touch right now. If I come back to our Files app here, we do now have an option to make a new document, spreadsheet, or presentation, and if I make a test document here, it's going to ask us if we want to use a template. I'll just make a blank document. Collabora does load fairly quickly with this native package. You can see there it didn't load in sections or tiles like it did when we were using Docker in my previous video. And we can go ahead and type. And if I type some gibberish, we can see that the spell checker is working. So that's great. We now have Nextcloud, we have Collabora. The last thing we're going to do is set up that fancy new high-performance backend. Like I said, right now, this browser tab is sending a request to the Nextcloud server every 30 seconds, checking for new notifications. Since I had Nextcloud also open in a different web browser earlier, this tab is also checking every 30 seconds for new notifications. So every 15 seconds, my web server is having to respond to a request right now, even if I just leave these pages open and don't click anything on them. That's a lot of continuous load that we don't need. So let's set this high-performance backend up. To do that, we're going to browse to the Apps section first. We'll go down to the Tools category, and we're looking for one called Client Push. It's a little bit confusing. They refer to this application as several different things in different places. In the App Store right now, it's called Client Push. you can see if we follow the link to the documentation calls it notify push. And then their press release calls it high performance backend. So at least 3 different official names for it. We're going to click download and enable, and it was downloaded there and enabled. It is not going to be functioning by default. We're going to come back to our terminal. I'm going to run sudo -u www data php var www nextcloud occ notify _push : setup. So when we install that app, we'll have a new subcommand for OCC available. We're going to use the OwnCloud console to set up the notify push application. And this is going to sort of walk us through the process. It's not going to do all the configuration automatically, but it will tell us what we need to do. So I'm going to press enter here, and it's telling us place the following systemd config at etc systemd system notify push.service. So this is the path to a unit file that it wants us to create, and it's telling us what needs to go into that unit file. I'm going to create a new tab here, and I'm going to SSH into the same server, root at nextcloud.nerdonthestreet.com. And I'm going to go ahead and nano into the file it's telling us to create. As you can see, it's empty right now because it doesn't exist. I'll just copy all of this unit configuration. So this is just a simple systemd service. It's using this to automatically start the Rust binary, which is this notify push executable. It's passing in the path to the Nextcloud config file for that executable because the executable will actually read our Nextcloud config, so we don't have to configure it separately. There are a couple of environment variables that we're setting when we're running that, but aside from that, nothing else special is going on here. We'll just save that file, and then like it's telling us to do, we will go ahead and enable it with the -- now option to also start it at the same time. We'll come back over here and press enter to continue, and this is going to fail. Like I said, I would expect that this process is going to change because right now it's telling us to do some more configuration. I'm not entirely clear on why it doesn't just do this configuration for us. We've got 3 things failing right now. It says we're using an unencrypted HTTPS for our push server. It says our push server URL is set to localhost, which doesn't sound right. And then it also says our push server is not a trusted proxy. Now this trusted proxy one, we're going to fix that, and that's also going to fix the other 2. The reason I'm confused about why this is set up the way that it is because this is not an Apache config option. This is just a Nextcloud config option. This is the public IP address of this server, which it was able to find automatically. And if we nano into var www nextcloud config.php, we'll come down to the bottom here, and you can see there's a new section called Trusted Proxies. The setup script made this section for us, and it knows what needs to go here, but it's not going to put it there for us. We need to put a new entry here. Since there's already a 0 and a 1, I'll just add a 2 to this array. And I'm going to paste in the public IP address of our server. We'll save that, and now if we run that notify push setup command again, you can see it says everything is functioning properly. The next step here, it's telling us to enable some proxy modules, which we already did for Collabora, so we don't need to worry about that. And it's giving us 3 lines of configuration that we need to add to our Apache configuration now. So this, once again, is going to have to be manual, but I'll come over to our other tab again. I'll nano into etc apache 2 sites enabled nextcloud le/ssl.conf. And I'm going to put in those 3 proxy lines so that our web browser can access the WebSocket for this Rust daemon. I'll save that. I'll reload Apache 2. And we'll come back over here. It told us to restart Apache 2 and not reload because it was assuming that we wouldn't have those modules enabled by default. But if I press enter, you can see it now says reverse proxy seems to be set up correctly and configuration saved. If I run the whole setup script again, it's just going to tell us everything is good to go now. So that is it. The high performance backend should be working now. If I come back over here to our Nextcloud server and I navigate to a different page, notifications now would come up instantly, not waiting for a 30-second interval, and our web browser would only be making a poll to the server every 5 minutes. Now, how do we actually know that that's working? Well, short of making a packet capture and checking how often our web browser is actually checking with the server, we can tell that it's working with the logging for the high-performance backend daemon. I'm going to run journalctl -u notify push to view the logs for the notify push unit using systemd, and I'm going to pipe that through cat so we don't have to worry about pagination. As you can see, by default, this is not logging very much. It's basically only logging when it's starting and stopping. We can fix that by changing our logging settings for the high performance backend. I'm going to nano back into our unit configuration file, etc systemd, system notify push.service. I'm going to add a third environment variable here, and this is coming straight from the documentation for the notify push application. If we pass in an environment variable, log equals notify push equals, and then the level of logging we want to perform, that will tell this binary that it needs to log more. There are several different options we could put here. We could use info, we could use debug. I'm going to put trace just to see absolutely everything that could possibly be logged. I'm going to save that. I'm going to run systemctl daemon reload to read in the change that I made to that service file. And then I'm going to run systemctl restart notify underscore push. And now if I run my journalctl command again, I'm going to put -f for follow. I'll get rid of the cat there. And now, as you can see, we're going to get logs when web browsers and desktop clients and mobile clients, when anything connects to this notification daemon. Now, it might not be a good idea to always have the trace option on because as you can see, it just printed out our database password in plain text in the logging here, and that was a trace log. But if I come back to our web browser and I reload this page, you can see that when the page loads, we're going to make a connection. The debug logging is going to show the process of authenticating when a client connects, and then we get an info line every time we have a client authenticate. And you can also see there we just had another line pop up sending ping to admin. So this executable here that is not running through PHP or Apache, this is its own program that's running, but it is communicating through that Apache reverse proxy that we set up with our web browser, staying connected so that it can relay notifications when it needs to. So that is everything I wanted to show you guys today. This is a fully functional Nextcloud server now. It is highly performant for the resources that we're giving it, and it's got all of the apps that we want. Of course, you can install more apps through the App Store if you want more functionality out of your server. I hope this video was helpful to you. If it was, you can go to nerdclub.knots.co and join the Nerd Club for just $3 a month to help me make more videos about Linux and open source software like this one. For now, though, that's everything I had to show you. So I'm Jacob Kaufman, I'm the Nerd on the Street, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.